The first two sentences of the Tao Te Ching goes as follow. Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao. Ming ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. The way which is spoken of is not the way. The name which is spoken of is not the name. Wu Ming Tian Di Shi She, You Ming Wang Wu Zhi Mu. The nameless beginning of earth and sky is the mother of all named things. The pictographs of these sentences show that at the very first there was a happy woman with two bare breasts, which granted was the case for most of us, since as far as I know, as of yet, no one has come from a cloning tank. The most beautiful depiction of said woman, as she sits on our mysterious feline throne, is in my opinion John William Waterhouse's depiction of Circe offering the cup to Ulysses. I always used to hold his painting of Hypnos and Thanatos with their opium incense in highest regard. I also think the Ophelia by his Pre-Raphaelite brother John Everett Millais is better than his. But that is a morbid thing to say. However, having now noticed the lions on Circe's throne, the tables have been overturned by that mighty enchantress. You will recall that we began our journey by looking for our guide, which Lao Tzu both cautions against and encourages in the aforementioned paragraphs. And in the first episode, the 8,000-year-old nameless lady at Çatalhöyük told of a clue that pointed out for us the contours of the way which she had already traveled in previous lives. Those Venus figurines of Europe, however, seem to lack their feline consorts. Which is why it's time to mention that it was also here in the cold north that in 1937 SS Sturmbannführer Robert Wetzel discovered the dark Swabian Hollenstein Stadel cave, where lay sleeping the Ivory Lion woman. Being a Nazi, of course, he didn't understand what he had stumbled across, and I guess we can thank only our sorceress that she, though silent for more than 40,000 years, still had the strength to cast a spell on him and make sure Wetzel didn't put the decorated mammoth bone fragments in a big sack with every stone and pebble from that cave labeled quote-unquote shit to be cleaned out as we continue our search for the Atlantean Visigoths. And so we had to wait until the summer of love when Gudrun Enslin and Andreas Baader, Thorwald Proll, went underground to form the Red Army fraction in the house of Che Guevara's French journalist friend Régis Debras. It was during Christmas of that year, 1969, with the SS doctor long dead, that Joachim Hanwitt began laying a puzzle with the 260 pieces. Carbon dating would later determine that the Ivory Lion woman was older than any of the undisputed Venus figurines, and as such the oldest confirmed statue ever discovered became a piece in our greater puzzle regarding the role played by these cat animals during the age of matrilineal communes. The nameless lady at Çatalhöyük then swung her wand again and pointed towards her own future, when she received the name Cybele, and the days of the written word where we found out that she had turned that famous boar huntress Atalanta into a feline of some kind. And indeed the most frequent depictions of what has been excavated so far of our Stony Hill People's Commune are precisely boars and felines. Hopefully today we will get one step closer to understand what that huntress-prey duality is all about. But perhaps a clue is expressed in Atalanta's story, for her mentor, Artemis, the goddess of the hunt who raised her, did not, according to herself, hunt boars only to eat them or for fun. No, her curse, the curse which she cast after being forgotten and ignored by the Greek patriarchs, was to release the monstrous Caledonian boar so that it would eat all the crops of these well-established agriculturalists. And this, even according to the story, became the first node for all the people of Greek mythology to come together, just as Atalanta joined in the collective of the Argonauts under somewhat similar circumstances would again a generation later, because ecological mismanagement by one affects us all, irregardless of clan lineage. In short, once again these ancient witches are giving us clues of landscape management and the consequences of it being ignored, rather than enticing the victorious thrill of the hunt, which is how latter bards and indeed many of our archaeologists would generally remember it. So back to the near future via Circe of John William Waterhouse's painting, where she is seen offering Odysseus a potion and holding up her magic wand, having turned 2 of his crew members into wild boars. One is lying next to the feline throne, and the other, just like us, dear listener, is peeking behind the big ancient, or perhaps clear, mirror, in front of which our woman of the whole of time sits, just for a while, for the time being. Hermes the rascal has already prepared Odysseus with a plant that will make sure he doesn't also become one of Circe's pets. But even the Trismegistus, protector of thieves and merchants alike, for at least he was wise enough to not draw or make a distinction between those, can nonetheless not make sure that the original hero resists sleeping with her, as she desires, before being allowed to make his leave with the crew. A fuck for a shipload of lives, Odysseus turned whore, charges a heavy price. The contradictions of this femme fatale, which Waterhouse would romanticize again in another painting of a poisoned pond, an ecological theme for the dangers of love if there ever was one, is certainly also, considering that material background, the primary historical contradiction of boars and felines engaged in an endless setting of the balance that maintains the constructed landscape. And that's not just me saying such things about the terrified delights of her phallic staff that once pegged Homer's protagonist. Let me read to you the first lines of the first poem that the Roman bard Publius Ovidius Naso dedicated to this love drama of the poisoned pond, the triangle of Glaucus, Circe, and Scylla. And now you have the opportunity to be like Leo DiCaprio, pointing towards the screen when you hear some themes that might suggest a contradiction between natural farming and agriculture. And Glaucus the Euboean, god who haunts the swollen surge, swarm hard, he never paused, past Athena heaped upon the giant's jaws, and past the Cyclops' fields, which know no plough or harrow, and are rich and fertile, though they never see yoked cattle. Then he raced past Rhegium and Messina, towns that face each other as they flank those narrow straits that swallow passing ships and separate Ausonia and Sicily. Now he, with stalwart strokes, cleaves the Tyrrhenian sea and reaches green hillsides and Circe's halls, her palace full of phantom animals. As soon as he's seen Circe, after she and he have given and received their greetings, he says, "O goddess, may you pity me, a god. You are indeed the only one who can, if I am worthy of your care, give me the remedy for love's despair. Daughter of the sun, I know as well as anyone the power herbs possess, for I was changed by them. But now you'll hear the cause of my wild frenzy. On the coast of Italy, where it lies opposite Messina's walls, I first caught sight of Scylla. Won't repeat to you, I'm too ashamed, my pleas and promises, my flattery, my words. They all were treated scornfully. But now, if magic chants have any force, do let your sacred lips entrance her heart, or if the better way is herbs, I pray, do choose an herb whose power has been proved. Don't cure my longing, do not heal my wound." End of quote. Many more to the romantic, interesting things happen in this story, of course. But the setting of the antagonistic stage in this manner is all we need for now. It has been said by wiser Sami poets than me that people are most beautiful when their glorias have fallen askew. And the wabi-sabi of not wanting your longing cured, nor your wounds healed, is of course what we sign up for. For how else would we remind ourselves of our struggle against the contemporary order of things? And many are those who have taken the wrong herbs, as to try to forget the inhumanity of this system that enslaves us. These products of escape are of course often synthesized today, and their sellers and buyers are larger in number than when Glaucus came begging to Circe. But though we will never find them, the 7 sorcerers of the matrilineal communes, we must continue our search. Such is our vow. Therefore, I have one last story to tell you. Granted, 40,000 years' depth is a good range and measure of our dedication, which outsmarts the fringe archaeologists' search for the 7 Edfu Egyptian founders of Septepi, the first time, as Hancock would have it. Or the 7 wise men of Greece, the 7 lucky, mostly main gods, but the one of Shinto, the 7 Apkallu of Mesopotamia, 7 worthies of the bamboo grove in China, or the 7 wise men which feudal Rome took, stole, or borrowed, from perhaps the patriarchs of Syria, or Persia, or Arabia, the Spanish Vandals, or any of the Hebrew tribes. Patriarchal ideological bullshit, sure, Marcus. But why are you suggesting that these 7 were originally women? Well, let me begin answering that question by asking you this. Where does the New Age PSYOP invest most of its Nazi energy of obscuration? Well, in the Pleiades, of course. Their last Aryo-heroic fortress of psychic confusion and manipulation. And why, might I add, have they as of late turned them into wisdom-loving, gentle-looking, blonde and blue-eyed Nordics, whose only business, it seems, is to ejaculate their star seeds into all those not yet equipped with the Marxist contraception of authentic resistance? Well, if you asked the Laconophiles Alfred Rosenberg or Adolf Hitler, they would probably say something like, Plato has said in Protagoras that Socrates said that actually, quote, Spartanizing is much more a love of wisdom than a love of physical exercise, end of quote, and that Socrates is the first of the sages, but the most developed and final sage is Chilon of Sparta, i.e. the politician who is credited with having institutionalized the militarization of Spartan society. In this version of the aesthetics of violence, as Mishima would have put it, only the nuclear war power of the Pleiadians can ensure that some, in the words of Nietzsche this time, are forced to labor so that others can be idle and explore the wisdom of the sages, thinking about thinking. Now many people, including those who get paid to read Plato full time, knows that Socrates is probably being sarcastic or ironic. Furthermore, many are those who know that the Pleiades were originally called the Seven Sisters by numerous peoples all over the world in the days of the matrilineal communes. Some have suggested that it is indeed the oldest mythological motif in existence, older than the ivory lion woman at about 100,000 years. This lines up quite nicely with my theory of landscape production, which I will tell you about in today's episode. So, let's finish the intro by looking into how scholars of mythology came to this conclusion. For it is 1,000,000 times more exciting than the New Age versions. A first interesting curiosity was put forward by the astronomer Frank Edge, whom, when searching for evidence for a proto-zodiac in the Ice Age, which I believe I have mentioned before, noticed that prehistoric cave paintings of aurochs in Lascaux in southern France on occasion have 6 dots above them, and came to the conclusion that since the Pleiades are to be found in the Taurus constellation, these paintings may in fact represent the Seven Sisters. He points out that not only are they the same number of visible stars, as seen from that location, but their configuration closely resembles the same quote-unquote spatial relationships of individual stars within the cluster. As well, quote, they have approximately the same relationship as the Pleiades to the head and face of the related bull, end of quote. Taken together, the image is reminiscent, obviously, of Jacques Gavin's original religious duality of the woman, in this case women, and the bull, which already suggests a much earlier origin, by a margin, than the oldest undisputed depiction accompanied by text which we have of them, which, and sorry to sound like a broken record of astronomical history of ideas, is Chinese. It is found in the annals of 2357 BC, later described, I believe, by accounts like those of the aforementioned Bamboo Grove, but which nonetheless interestingly enough points out that this is the very same year as the 7th semi-legendary Chinese emperor Yao was born. Make of that what you will. If it is patriarchal lie, at least we know something about the fabric with which it was spun. And for those of you not finely tuned and calibrated to the general chronology of Chinese mythology, it was during the reign of Emperor Yao that the Great Flood began. A flood so vast that no parts of Yao's territory was spared, and both the Yellow River and the Yangtze valleys flooded. Heyerdahl points out, quote, in all corners of the Polynesian triangle, the practice of building reed boats survived or was remembered. Almost universal was the royal use of feather cloaks and feather headdresses, mummification, circumcision rites, the difficult surgical operation of trepanation, an advanced calendar system with the new year starting with the first annual appearance of the Pleiades. End of quote. Hamlet's Mill famously suggests that myths are encoded with astronomical and other scientific, for example, ecological and nautical data. This was one of the major arguments of the first season with regards to the phronesis of navigation. And it's not for nothing that the Greek word Pleiades probably means sail. Now everyone knows about the Mayan calendar and its ending, or at least they think they know. But what of its beginning? Heyerdahl suggests that the Polynesians in part inherited their calendar from the Mayans, or rather, whomever the Mayans got their calendar from, and says in addition about this often overlooked beginning, quote, "The Mayan calendar was so accurate that it was based on an astronomical year of 365.2420 days, which is only 1 day short in every 5,000 years, while our own modern calendar is based on a year of 365.2425 days, which is a day and a half too much in every 5,000 years. On the ancient Mexican burial pyramid at Palenque is left an inscription stating that 81 months make 2,392 days. An observation giving these early American astronomers a month of 29.53086 days, which deviates by only 24 seconds from the true length. Why, may we ask, did the early Mexicans begin their very exact time reckoning with the calendar year 4 Ahau 2 Kumu, that is, August 12th, 3113 BC? Some believe that the Indians snatched this date out of the air just to have some date for beginning their calendar. Others think they may have worked back to some specific astronomical conjunction, occurring long before even Olmec civilization began. The fact that the date concurs so remarkably with important events in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and great migrations in the Mediterranean world, could indicate that the concurrence in time was something more than coincidental. End of quote. I'm being very mean here, for we do not have the time to speak about what happened on August 12th, 3113 BC in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean in detail, other than, of course, this being the, by archaeologists and anthropologists, well accepted date for the historical beginning of class society. The details will come in season 3. But already now, this begs an additional question. How the fuck did the Mayans and the Polynesians know that? Many thousands of years before the advent of their own class society and its associated agriculture. Well, because, sister and brothers, we communists of the oceanic highways have always known what's going on, in particular the activities of the patriarchal enemy, be it even on the opposite end of the globe. And maybe we also knew when it was time to fuck off. Furthermore, the Aztecs and the Mayans inherited 2 sets of calendars of 2 separate wheels. The matrilineal wheel of the moon and Apollos of the sun. Both found themselves within one major 52-year cycle. The lunar cycle has a set of 13 days by 20 days. The tropical year calendar holds a cycle of 18 days by 20 days, plus an additional 5 unlucky days, equaling 365. These two simultaneously spin completely around to make the beginning of both calendars. It equals 52 years, called, quote-unquote, the binding of the years. Once the deceiving clergy caught whiff of their own predicament, they instituted a ceremony associated with this period, the binding of the years, and interpolated the need of a sacrificial rite, a bound human. As the Pleiades passed over the zenith about midnight and set over the western horizon, this symbolized that another 52-year cycle could safely come into being, as pointed out by historian Ed Krupp of the International Astronomical Union in one of his many debunking articles of the great 2012 scare. We will remember here, most of all, the askewness, the wabi-sabi, and not the perfection, i.e. the unlucky, or rather missing days, because this will eventually help us with the age of the motif. But first, let's also note that the quote-unquote safely coming into being obviously doesn't really concern the celestial wheels per se. I think everyone knew already back then that they will keep spinning in their cosmic sense. But we could presume that it concerns the true uncertainties of coming into being during said period, and that the Seven Sisters knew a lot about childbirth, and maybe their role as midwives is why they are so sought after. Childbirth being that one anomaly which makes modern statistics of lifespans produce a demarcation line between us and the prehistoric. Remove this presumed rational addition to the schematics and we, and the quote-unquote cave people, lived for just as long. The oldest found remains in Sweden, for example, not a very hospitable place 10,000 years ago, was around 70 years old. That the maximum human lifespan, approximately 125 years, has barely changed since we arrived, is something most scientific journals which touch on this topic will attest to. But the second presumption, that of the deaths in childbirth and infant mortality, which pushes down the people of prehistory to an average life of 30 years, was initially compiled by the bourgeois statisticians in the 19th century, and mostly calibrated since then by numbers from written history and burials of those times. That is to say, periods of class society of the patriarchs, which as a gender and the owners of the means of reproduction, for whatever traditional reason, tend to stay away from the room where birth is taking place and knowledge is accumulated about its difficulties and their possible solution. And I'm quite serious, I've never felt more fucking stupid than when that took place in my own life. And I just would have bowed on all four to those ladies to make sure. Now, I'm not saying they skewed the numbers in the records throughout history, which the bourgeoisie then used. No, they clearly didn't, since we end up with this average life of 30 years. Ridiculously low, and, that's on them as rulers. I'm saying that they, as the owners of the means of reproduction, after prehistory, until quite recently, didn't know much about the goings-on of the down on the blood-stained floor. in this case a woman's body and the delivery of a child rather than a factory and the making of a commodity, which maybe they need not have, had they not backed up their impotent ignorance by insisting time and time again on banning, impoverishing, and burning at the stake all those wise old women. I'm saying that the patriarchy consciously and unconsciously, i.e., ideologically and out of pure spite, fucked up their own birth statistics. And in the days before, the epidemics of urbanization, agriculture, domestication, and husbandry, still today the big child killers, when the midwife was likely the most important person in the commune. Probably, though we cannot know for certain, we lived lifespans that matched our contemporary numbers of longevity, insofar that they are a somewhat average biological normal of just being fully nutritionally fed, quenched and cleaned with clean water, the lack of which constitutes the second half of the big child killers, until today. Now if the 7 were not all midwives, then the quote-unquote safely coming into being could also mean knowledge of how plants are best taken care of as they make that journey from seed to full tree, shrub or grass, etc. The academic journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science had an interesting piece regarding this Mayan story a couple of years ago. Quote, Avila Vera remembers practical uses of stargazing. Her godfather once brought her to a cornfield before dawn and pointed to a bundle of stars that were soon washed away in the light of the rising sun. Those stars were the Pleiades, and he told her that the cluster's pre-dawn appearances began as the harvest approached. If the stars in the cluster looked distinct instead of blurry, it meant a clear atmosphere, sunny skies, and a good crop. Similar practices persist in indigenous communities in the Andes. In 2000, a team of scientists argued in Nature that a blurry view of the early dawn Pleiades can reliably tip off villagers to expect El Niño conditions and less rain months later. End of quote. We certainly welcome agricultural explanations, especially with regards to El Niño as it relates to the Victorian Holocausts. And as such, they are stories about the earned respect this precious star cluster received from the subjects of the two-wheeled when the sisters walked among them. Though by now we are dealing with a three-wheeled system, I guess. The stars, the moon, and the sun. As they also organized many of the activities of natural farming. Fucking American bombers always flying around here, man. And though one Mayan name for them is a fistful of seeds, within quotes, we are nonetheless looking for something older, something more special, that will really put rare gold on the table of feasts in the days when, as I and the Buddha have said, the harvest needed no sowing. The real honey of the festivities, when latter simple gifts of agriculture would have fallen short. Well, thankfully enough, the Pleiades are also an important part of the myth, ritual, and agriculture to the Barasana tribe of Colombia, a small tribe of around 300 that have been able to remain relatively isolated from European influence. The Barasana myth of creation begins with the earth as dry and barren. Romi Kumu, the mother of all people, made a grill and placed it on the mountains, and it became the sky. Then she opened the water door in the sky and let water come rushing onto the earth, and she created all creatures. So maybe she too knew of the hydraulic practice of how to store water in mountains. And she's not just someone who took a piss, as in the Greek patriarchal myth. Romi Kumu had a special gourd, which the Barasana people wanted. They chased her and finally found her in the east. She gave them a gourd, but it was the wrong one, and the people were angry. They were going to kill her. But after she had given the people the first gourd, she climbed into the sky through the water door and became the Pleiades. From this we see the searcher, those 7 searched for, the trick, and their ingenious escape, which are motifs which I beg of you to remember, dear listener, as we go along, reaching our climax of this story. For you see, the gourd of Romi Kumu is filled with beeswax, and the beeswax inside the gourd and its honey is associated with the Pleiades, which are also described as bees buzzing in the sky. The gourd can also be filled with sweet water for long journeys when water is salty, and their botanical origin remains one of those unexplained curiosities in regards to how they arrived on the Polynesian islands, if they do indeed come from the Americas, which is what the botanists suggest. So we ask then, who first filled a gourd with water and went searching for honey? The honey of the Pleiades beeswax. Is Orion, who follows the Pleiades on our night sky, originally with his club, as the Greeks suggested, not so much a hunter, as he is rather the one who clubs down the beehive? After Artemis, the mentor of our dear boar huntress, Atalanta, had put him next to them in the sky. Or have you never wondered what the fuck is he supposed to have hunted with a club? Not the most ranged weapon there ever was when stalking something that weighs almost 100 kilos and runs at an insane speed of 40 kilometers per hour, like the wild boar. And just to make sure that this is not a Eurocentric question exported with violence, as we have made much too many references to the Greeks and their psychic material of their primordial repression in today's intro. Though, after all, I am European, so not doing that would seem a bit, let's say, pretentious. And it wouldn't really be my repressed material. Though ultimately, of course, it is. That is our primordial theory. We must finally mention that the relatively isolated Aborigines of Australia tell a very similar story. That's the story of the Berai Berai, sometimes known by other, very different names, and I'm sure I butchered that name, as no one knows just how many language families there might be over there, down under. The Berai Berai were the honey-gifting searchers of the 7 sisters of the dreaming, who would eventually, due to their love for them, also end up in the sky, becoming the stars which we know as Orion's belt. And thanks to the collecting work of Soviet ethnographer and historian Yuri Berezkin, we know that these stories are but 2, the Greek and the Australian, among 90 as of yet known distinct separate peoples of the world who do tell such a story. So you see, dear listener, I'm not just doing perennial wisdom a la Alan Watts or Aldous Huxley. Those are some Marxist scientific numbers. These Aborigines came to Australia long before anyone painted female dots and male bulls in the Lascaux cave. But their story will nonetheless be subject to the same spontaneous critique. One which some of you might have noticed already, dear listeners, the anxiety of which you will now be relieved of as I bring it up, finally. But why 6 dots in the cave? It's 7 sisters, right? Well, here is where it gets interesting. And in a spooky way, even more materially scientific, as this theory will have us go way beyond the already impossible 16,000 years old pigment that depicts the raw imagination of the European cave paintings of the cosmos, if that is indeed the case. Two astronomers called Norris and Norris, they have a different first names, of course, from the Sydney Institute for Astronomy and Sydney University, describes the puzzle in the following way. Quote, "There are two puzzles surrounding the Pleiades, or seven sisters. First, why are the mythological stories surrounding them typically involving 7 young girls being chased by a man associated with the constellation Orion? So similar in vastly separated cultures such as the Australian Aboriginal cultures and Greek mythology. Second, why do most cultures call them 7 sisters, within quotes, even though most people with good eyesight see only 6 stars? Here we show that both these puzzles may be explained by a combination of the great antiquity of the stories combined with the proper motion of the stars, and that these stories may predate the departure of most modern humans out of Africa around 100,000 BC." End of quote. In northern Australia, these searchers, finders and navigators, rather than just hunters, came by a large canoe, and they are themselves the 3 bright stars in what we know as the Belt of Orion. A motif which again they share with many other people, including the Maori people of Aotearoa. Is that the right word? Aotearoa, which is their word for, or the original word for New Zealand. I don't even know where Zealand is, so I'm not a racist Anglo-Saxon. Yes, my ignorance of the English will set me free. It does look like South Wales, right? It's got kangaroos all over it. Oh, shit. Anyway, from whom it represents the Tainui Waka, their great ocean-faring vehicles, which are intimately connected with the Pleiades in Pacific star lore. We don't know if they left Africa by those ocean-faring vessels 100,000 years ago, but the trail does follow the coast of Southern Asia after all, and perhaps those spots were reused harbors rather than one-time camp spots, as the out-of-Africa model of anatomically modern humans is right now being rewritten as a complex series of waves rather than a single event. The final conclusion of this fairly short but nonetheless astronomically dense paper is in their own words that, quote, "From 50,000 BC onwards, the Aboriginal people enjoyed a continuous, unbroken culture, with very little contact with outsiders other than annual visits from Macassan Trepang collectors to the far north of Australia over the last few hundred years. Aboriginal culture evolved continuously with no discontinuities or significant outside influences until the arrival of the British in 1788, making Aboriginal Australians among the oldest continuous cultures in the world. When the Australians and Europeans were last together in 100,000 BC, the Pleiades would have appeared as 7 stars. Given that both cultures refer to them as 7 sisters, and that their stories about them are so similar, the evidence seems to support the hypothesis that the 7 sisters story predates the departure of the Australians and Europeans from Africa in 100,000 BC. End of quote. The reason for this conclusion is that one of the stars, which hundreds of stories all over the world refer to as the lost seventh sister, or something akin to that effect, is a dwarf star that has, from our earthly point of view, drifted into the more dominant luminosity of one of the bigger stars, making it invisible as a separate individual source of light. And you might be saying, that sounds cool, even plausible and everything, Marcus, but do we seriously have any evidence of our natural farming communes and their activities that are twice as old as the oldest undisputed Venus statues of 50,000 years ago? Can we really say anything about an economic base of a whopping 100,000-year-old age when the sisters were still 7 and no one had gotten lost? Well, dear listener, there wouldn't be much of an episode tonight if I claimed we couldn't. So, welcome to the return of the repressed and the second season finale of our early Communism and the Ocean series.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome, dear listener. Very happy to sit down with you this evening. I'm surrounded by the white mountains and I can see their stop-motion looking storms up there as the sun sets, painting them in a copper hue. It would, as I have complained before, be very cozy and nice. I'd probably even invite people for a retreat, had it not been for the fact that I am too poor. Having lived on the Patreon salary of $1,000 a month or less for almost a year now, since they fired me at the school. Which means we are still living in a house without an open fireplace, a proper cabin stove, or insulation. But you know, I dress well with many layers, and complaints aside, thanks to all the patrons who stick around and to those new here tonight. You are very welcome, and don't be afraid to drop a comment. There are only good people on this uncharted island of the internet. Some of you might still be going around swearing or crying or denying the fact that this is the season finale. We didn't even get to any tasty Heydal theories yet. Damn it. And I know, I'm sorry. But that third season will come, I promise. Maybe even this year, as I have a lot prepared already about lost seafaring peoples, Sumerian measurements, and old scary books that makes me afraid of the dark when I'm out of breath on the couch just looking for number combinations in desperation. The reason for the delay is precisely this tedious work of picking and choosing of what stays in and what will be left for the future. I mean, for example, considering how much I have been talking about archaic mothers this season, I should have made some reference also to the heroes of second-wave feminist archaeology in the 70s, like Heidi Göttner Abendroth, Merlin Stone, or Merlin, maybe? And of course, Maria Gimbutas. Though she did get a shout-out in the first season for her struggle against the lizards at Cambridge University. But fear not, in between the second season of the very early days when it's both harder and easier to say something about our boat-building communists, and the third season to come, hopefully more set in the time of the betrayal of the pyramids, there will be an interview with an Indonesian anarchist who has studied and written a book about the classless societies of the Maluku Spice Islands. They are the Spice Islands, and their struggle against the Dutch trading company. I have also already sat down with my very good friend Francis, who has lived with one of the very last indigenous communists of Eurasia, in the jungles where I also once set up my bamboo hut for many a month, all those years ago. And adding some anecdotal knowledge about the most indigestible notion made in the intro. Know that I only got malaria and yellow fever in the cities over there, never in the jungle with the orang asli. So it is not an abrupt season finale. You will receive a very enticing epilogue. Furthermore, talking about prospects of this new year, the Interpol season with Matt from Ghost Stories is also quickly taking shape, and in addition, me and Cloney from Para Power Mapping have already recorded the first 2 episodes of the Swedenborgian hypno-murders during the interwar period in the 20s and 30s. I know most of you need no convincing, and I love the benefit of doubt that you grace me with, which makes this the best occupation I've ever had. For as my nana used to say, please don't operate heavy machinery. You'll hurt yourself and others. But still, do stick around, friends. It will be worth it. But now, it's time to go back as far as possible, because we need to finally know, where did the wild grains of our egalitarian economic base come from? And I have prepped and promised you some carpet truth bombing, have I not? In preparation of this series, I have compiled an anthology of sorts of what I found to be some of the most interesting publications on the history of prehistoric farming, cultivation, agriculture, and domestication in mainly the last 20 years, but also before. This story, as my working theory sees it, which is in no way definitive or exhaustive, obviously, and which does not exist in its compilation anywhere else but here on the Return of the Repressed, explained with the utmost simplicity, is the following. Millions of years ago, humans, as they stood up on 2 legs, began following around large herds of grazing animals during their seasonal cross-continental processions, which took place almost all over the world. In the wake of these gigantic wanderers, we found a landscape transformed by these herbivores with nitrogen-rich soil in concentration around water sources. Wild small seed grain plants at some point began adapting and selecting traits favorable to the metabolism that existed between them and these mammals. Mammals which, like us, cared for their young, to pass down habits and memory knowledge of long-distance wandering, and whom in a pre-shamanic sense became our spirit animals and guides, teaching us the ways of the one-straw revolution. Now, give me 2 hours or so, and I'll make it clear to you what the implications of those paragraphs are and how that truth bomb was built. Following these animals around, we realized early on that there were other foodstuffs involved in the praxis of hunting, and began consuming the grains which followed in the wake of, and simultaneously guided the forward movement of the herds. According to a 2019 joint study called Grazing Animals Drove Domestication of Grain Crops from the Max Planck Institute and Washington University, some of the most notable are and were, for example, the Great Bison Belt in America, which during its peak ran from Alaska to the Gulf of Mexico, wild yaks and goats across Central Asia, which conquered the globe's highest mountains and harshest winds, the far-distancing wild range of wildebeests, which rocked all our boats in the cathedral that is cinema when we were too young to know about the closet skeletons of Walt Disney. The unwitting killers of Mufasa were flanked by antelopes, zebras, warthogs, and hundreds of other kinds of large and small grazing hoofed four-leggers, collectively called ungulates, from the West Atlantic coast along the Sahel, which cuts right across towards the Red Sea on the eastern end, along the south of the Horn further down across the eastern coast of what is today Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, before spreading out over much of the rest of the south, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, Angola, etc., etc. Then we also have, lest we forget, the Andean camelids of South America, the llamas, alpacas, vicuñas, and guanacos, crisscrossing and step-toeing over an area the size of which would have made the Incas jealous. These animals had collectively prepared the flora for our arrival during the Eocene. That is to say, the geological epoch that lasted from about 56 to 33.9 million years ago, when they began engaging with these plants in a magnificent dialectics called endozoochory, a phenomenon of the guise that we should take some time to explain. Endozoochory refers to seed dispersal by animal ingestion. It occurs when seeds are able to pass through the digestive tract of an animal while remaining viable, and are thus dispersed away from the parent plant in the animal's dung. Some of the young parental listeners, like myself, might have wondered more than once, without getting really into it, how those kernels of corn arrived to the place that they did, so intact. Well, we can presume that mere gravity, wind or water dispersal, may move the small seeds of many crop progenitors with only limited success. And in addition to this backdrop of limitations, in the 80s, an ecologist and conservationist called Daniel Hunt Jansen from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, put forward a quote-unquote characteristically imaginative and unorthodox, end of quote, theory that continues to inspire researchers to this day, called the quote-unquote foliage as fruit hypothesis. I believe he got the idea by building on an earlier microbial theory of his from the 70s. That microbial theory suggests that fruits rot, seeds mold, and meat spoils because microbes render food inedible, or at least distasteful, to animals with skeleton, not just as a byproduct of microbe-microbe competition or accidental waste products, but as a strategy to repel vertebrates consumers who would otherwise eat the food resource and the microbes themselves. And you might be thinking here, before we go on, why the mysterious tone of theories? Surely the evolution of plants have been fully understood. We live in the 3rd millennium after all. In the next season I will be getting more into trees, but I'll say right now that the beautiful thing about real science is that in the last 20 years, ecologists have had to abandon one of the most basic assumptions of biological science that has been with it from the very beginning, which is the question of how trees bring water from the soil to its leaves. Capillary action is no longer the heroic explainer it once was, and this basic question, according to German forester Peter Volleben, who has been a ranger of Rhineland beech forests since the 80s, is once again a mystery. The quote-unquote feuillange's fruit hypothesis best explains the dispersal mechanism for many grain crop progenitors, that is to say, the crop wild relatives of the ones we consume today. Jansen hypothesized that they evolved to take advantage of grazers, who inadvertently consume and disperse the seeds while eating leaves and stems. Impressive theory, you say, for it seems obvious once stated, but you'd be surprised to know that despite the theoretical groundwork within ecology, it would take a generation or two, up until about 20 years ago, after the fall of biblical archaeology, before it began to become incorporated into the archaeobotanical theories about cultivation and domestication. The progenitors, the early ancestors of many small-seeded domesticated grains, share a suite of traits that are characteristic of endozoochoric dispersal by the, in Latin, so-called chew-over-again animals, i.e. ruminants, including 1. Displaying seeds on the top of the plant. 2. High rates of dormancy. 3. Synchronistic ripening. 4. Lack of lineage-specific compounds or other anti-herbivory defenses. 5. Rapid annual growth. 6. Extremely high numbers of offspring. 7. Small seed size, usually less than 2 millimeters. 8. Round seeds. 9. Smooth seed surfaces. And finally, in most cases, 10. Lack of or delayed dehiscence. That is to say, the delayed splitting of a mature plant structure along a built-in line of weakness to release its contents. The opposite, immediate splitting, is common among fruits, but also various reproductive parts of flowers and mushrooms, etc., that have spores or pollen which needs to be quickly released. Whereas, if you go out now in winter, you'll still see dead plants standing with their seed capsules still on the dead plant, above ground. Those are probably the small grain seed progenitors. The benefit of animal dispersal, unlike for example pollen or spores, which travel with the wind or water streams, is that it can direct the spread of seeds to target sites, such as river edges or food plains, where conditions are ideal for colonization, depositing them in nitrogen-rich packages of dung. Likewise, this dispersal strategy helps plants avoid high-density dependent mortality. Of the above qualities, we shall investigate the most counterintuitive one, which because of its contradiction becomes the smoking gun for students of dialectics. During the Eocene, seeds began developing new anti-herbivory defenses, such as high phytolith production, which is Greek for plant stone and is basically a hardness made of silica. Silica is that element which occurs in most sand, and which when crystallized becomes, for example, quartz or opals, etc., and which is what we use today to make concrete, glass, and silicon, etc. In short, hard stuff that you don't want to eat. In response, herbivores, that is, plant-eating animals, evolved ruminant digestive systems and grinding teeth, allowing them to consume silicon-rich vegetation. Basically, the intestinal system of ruminant grazers holds back large plant material, including large seeds, for double digestion and fermentation. Because of this co-evolutionary relationship, ruminant dispersed seeds remain small and retain a hard testa, that is, seed coat, as well as a hard pericarp, that is to say, in the case of, for example, the almond fruit, the inner shell that immediately surrounds the edible almond. In the case of panicoids, which is the second largest subfamily of the grasses, including sorghum and maize, for example, this process would express itself through a hardening of the palea and lemma, which are the two coat layers which you pull off to reveal the corn cob inside, allowing them to effectively evade digestion. This is, for example, why, if you are familiar with unprocessed ancient grains varieties, such as einkorn, they can often not be dehusked or shaved in normal agricultural machines, but need more powerful stuff, which is problematic for modern grains should their dispersers for some reason disappear. And you know who they are. Which is one of many indications that historical periods of ferality or de-domestication is, as Chinese Michelinian trained scientists will tell you, a very understudied yet complex subject. I say Chinese Michelinian trained scientists to highlight the fact that the understudied character of the subject matter is a direct consequence of Western archaeobotanical over-reliance on standardized hard-line genetics. And because this was simultaneously the only time Flint Dibble, at least to my knowledge, in his debunking of Hancock on the Rogan show, went out of his depth saying it is a very understood mechanism. And it was the only time Rogan said something interesting, or asked something interesting.
But is it possible that this cycle of domesticating wheat and beans and all these different things has taken place many, many times? And that if you left them alone, they would go back to the wild form? How long would it take for them to revert back to their original
thousands
state?
Of years again.
Thousands of years again.
Thousands of years.
How many thousands of years, you think?
Well, I don't know, because I'd have to look that up.
I don't really blame Dibble for this assumption, since it is common genetic knowledge, within quotes, that it takes thousands of years. We remember this from the 1930s debates in the Soviet Union and at Columbia University. However, a 12-people-strong panel of scientists in 2021 at the National Observations and Research Station for Wetland Ecosystems of the Yangtze Estuary, as well as the Ministry of Education Key Laboratory for Biodiversity Science and Ecological Engineering at Fudan University in Shanghai, and finally Shanghai Key Laboratory of Plant Functional Genomics and Resources at the Shanghai Qianshan Botanical Garden, says the following in the very first paragraph, like the first lines of the paper. Quote, "Fertilization of crop plants has aroused an increasing interest in recent years, not only for the reduced yield and quality of crop production caused by feral plants, but also for the rapid evolution of novel traits, that facilitate the evolution and persistence of weedy forms. Yeah, I mean, it's almost self-evident, right? Like the reason why they are studying this is because farmers are experiencing this in their own lifetime, seeing, you know, that maybe some of their fields which are less tended to, or maybe even the ones that are very much tended to, because it's not usually done purely by machines, right? Like with wheat, is one of the reasons I would assume why it takes place so often in rice fields. But I could be wrong about that. But, you know, if it took thousands of years, you know, it wouldn't be their problem, right? And this was also agreed upon by more Western-trained researchers like Gressel in 2005 and Viguera et al. In 2013. Another Chinese team, Xia et al. In 2011 said that, quote, divergence in the minimum critical temperature for germination has been detected between the populations from the northeastern region and those from the eastern region, suggesting rapid adaptive evolution in germination behavior to local climatic conditions, right? And they explain actually this in a little bit more detail at another part in their study in a very interesting way. Quote, a notable feature that is shared by the weedy rice from eastern and northeastern China is that their seeds do not have primary dormancy, which you would expect, I guess, that if it went back to its wild state, is what I understand. Instead, these plants have developed a temperature-sensing mechanism to control the timing of seed germination during fertilization. End of quote. Of course, much more interesting stuff is said, but we will get there eventually in Season 3. To my great disappointment, some of Hancock's allies have already caught whiff of the weakness in this argument by Flint, but they don't say anything about the underlying contradiction between hardline genetic theories and those of archaeobotany, and instead try to make it look like Flint was lying. Always this, you know, bullshit about like individuals. Like he wasn't. He was simply interpolated to believe it. Like it's a common held assumption. What else should he have said? And furthermore, though we do not know for sure, since this is very novel research, it seems like the others are also wrong, because it's not as simple as a plant returning to its pre-domesticated state. For example, it might actually awake dormant traits still latent in its wild crop relatives. You know, maybe that they inherited from, you know, if they are a combination, let's say, of two other plants, which, you know, could have happened naturally by some, you know, some incident or coincidence. I don't want to say mutation, it's the only way it happens, but you know, it could have been also latent it could have been latent then in its wild crop relative state, and then activated by the feral process and combined with some of those it acquired during domestication. You see, like, it wouldn't have made a difference on its own if it had been activated, this trait. You know, it wouldn't have improved anything for the plant, and that's why it was never activated. And but now that it also has learned new traits by being domesticated, it might combine them to activate new ones, which is what? Fucking clever. It's too crazy, man. Oh yeah. Anyway, let's return to our wild progenitors then. Other plants that have developed endozoochoric dispersal mechanisms are quinoas, amaranths, some Asteraceae flowers such as sunflower, and various millets. Most of these small-seeded grasses and forbs flowers rarely appear naturally in dense stands, and some wild progenitors are rare or endangered today, which indicates their dependence on and loss of seed dispersers. Furthermore, this loss of seed dispersers, the contemporary state of things, is one of the factors that fooled anthropologists to presume a priority of hunting and a sense of struggle since what a pain it must have been for early humans to collect such rarely occurring plants. A little bit over here and then hope there will be a little bit more of it over there. The thing is, however, as we will see, that they lived in a world with much larger herds of seed dispersers. In this ignorance, which has been the case for a long time, we can also see the birth of the assumption that domestication, labor-intensive preparation of the soil and sowing, was somehow desirable and necessary, which also implies a conscious choice, an assumption which we will tackle later in, again, the third season. What is interesting about the morphology of these seeds and their dispersers, which will become a returning point as we go along in this historical chronology, is that in some cases, wild plants evolve larger or smaller seeds in order to recruit new seed dispersers, a process analogous to the eventual recruitment of humans during domestication. In addition, just to take an example that might reveal the reproduction of this so far theoretically dense jargon, some of you might have noticed that wild or feral cannabis sativa L plants thrive in areas of heavy herd animal activity. It is not a coincidence that almost all hash in China comes from either the sheep-dense grazing plains of the western central Asiatic lands of Xinjiang or the yak-dense valleys in the mountains of Tibet. It has been similarly theorized that megafaunal grazers were the natural dispersers for the progenitors, i.e. the early ancestors of cannabis, and that one of our oldest, if not the oldest, domesticates still remember her old ways when she jumps the fence of the plantation. It has also been theorized that it could have been an easy jump from dense riverside populations of cannabis deposited by wild-hoofed ungulates to become camp follower plants that eventually adopted humans as their dispersal mechanisms. We have already made a point in the hemp series about how important that must have been to early fibercloth and rope making, and we noted the interesting correlation of finding 1. The earliest prerequisites of boat making in terms of possible painted sails, lines, ropes, etc. 2. The earliest cave art depictions of boats, and 3. The homeland of cannabis, all geographically overlapping, many tens of thousands of years ago in Central Asia's Gobustan, around Azerbaijan. But despite the old age, we are nonetheless jumping far ahead. Our story is still on the level of pre-cultivation, when the main evolutionary interaction took place between animal and plants. But if we skip ahead from the tens of millions old Eocene, at least to the late Pleistocene, which began 130,000 years ago, together with the last interglacial, a warmer period of about 15,000 years, similar to ours, but, way back. And then continued with another glacial, of course, our last ice age, so to speak, which ended together with the late Pleistocene during the termination of the Younger Dryas, some 11,700 years ago, when the Holocene epoch began. During this 130,000 year period, we see something interesting happening around that particular time, 92,000 years ago, time frame of the intro, neatly coinciding then with the production of probably the oldest mythological motif still in use. The event, which has left a mark in the archaeological, geochronological, geomorphological, and paleo-environmental data, has no ecological analog in the preceding half-million-year record that we know of. In 2021, an interdisciplinary collaboration of researchers of the aforementioned fields combined their evidence and identified an instance in the very distant past of early humans bending environments to suit their needs. Natural farming stuff. The discovery was made around Lake Malawi, the fourth largest freshwater lake in the world by volume, home to more species of fish than any other lake in the world, probably due in part to the fact that it is a so-called meromictic lake, a rare type of lake that with available data only occur once among every 1,000 lakes. What is special about meromictic lakes is that their water never mixes, creating radically different layers or stratas of environment in its depth, Lake Malawi being the second deepest lake in Africa. It is already strategically located at the southern end of the aforementioned cross-continental wanderings of African animals, and as far as I can tell the last major stop of a massive body of water and shoreline before the wandering turns back northward again. Something which clearly did not escape our early landscape constructors, whom 80,000 years before the advent of agriculture began transforming their landscape into more fire-tolerant woodlands. These engineered landscape fires reduce arboreal cover and became crucial tools in maintaining grassland and forest patch environments, which are defining elements of anthropogenically mediated ecosystems. Not only did this increase the possible flow of animals and small grain seed grasses, but these large grazing herbivores that inhabit landscapes that are more open play also a role in maintaining them and in keeping woody vegetation from encroaching. This is one of the major reasons why we must not understand domestication as some sort of progress, because around Lake Malawi communists unlocked a natural dialectics that would with the least amount of effort possible produce for them, for an impossibly long time, conditions in which we could just sit and playfully compete in fishing the most beautiful or biggest fish, throw it back if we wanted to, and just watch as the crops came strolling in, self-fertilized, the unplowed fields worked by trunks, tusks, and hoofs, laugh our asses off at the mind-boggling lack of labor needed to manage our economic base. Telling good stories around the campfire, as behind us the clouds came rolling down the green mountains against a backdrop of astral diamond decoration. In the commune of the everlasting spring, where the harvest needs no sowing. There seems to me to have been only one enemy to this way of life that must have become the stuff of folklore and legends for people of Lake Malawi. For you see, meromictic lakes carry a very dark secret of horrified delights. These are the ancient lakes of the phallic mother which I spoke of. The natural phenomenon which produces this horrified delight of goddess-fearing is called a limnic eruption, also known as a lake overturn. It is a very rare type of natural disaster in which dissolved carbon dioxide suddenly erupts from deep lake waters, forming a deadly gas cloud capable of asphyxiating wildlife, livestock, and humans. In 1986, a notable event of this type took place at Lake Nyos in Cameroon, causing nearly 1,800 deaths. Scientists believe earthquakes, volcanic activity, and other explosive events can serve as triggers for limnic eruptions as the rising CO2 displaces water. If volcanoes are indeed the observable cause, then I will add the terrifying conclusions of these early Malawi communists to my list as the earliest indication of the Swedenborgian Freudian hypothesis that Jahwe was a volcano god. Jahwe, the one who, like other storm or natural disaster gods of that time and that location, bring death to enemies, is one thing. And the connection might be interesting enough, but since in this series we have always already been on the lookout for our female, feline guides, let's see if we can pull that inspiring feat off once again. To do that, we must first ask, Do these meromictic lakes only hold the mysteries of silent, invisible death of asphyxiating dissolved carbon dioxide? No, they do not. For the anaerobic conditions and the microbes it invites produce a wide range of gases with different mystical effects. In the ancient texts which concerns the Oracle of Delphi, most of them point towards a connection to geological gases rather than the intake of drugs. The literary texts include the testimony of ancient historians such as Pliny and Diodorus, philosophers such as Plato, poets such as Aeschylus and Cicero, geographers such as Strabo, the travel writer Pausanias, and even a priest of Apollo who served at Delphi, the famous essayist and biographer Plutarch. These writers consistently link the power of the oracle to natural features inside a temple, such as a fissure, a gaseous emission, and a spring. The geographer Strabo, 64 BC to 25 AD, wrote, quote, "They say that the seat of the oracle is a cave that is hollowed out deep down in the earth, with a rather narrow mouth, from which arises pneuma that inspires a divine frenzy, and that over the mouth is placed a high tripod, mounting which the Pythian priestess receives the pneuma and then utters oracles in both verse and prose." The historian Diodorus of Sicily, 1st century BC, noted an additional element in his description of the Delphic oracle. Quote, "They say that the water of the Cassotis spring plunges underground and emerges in the aditon of the temple, where it makes the women prophetic." Phthia, the title of the high priestess of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, is like the older word for the site, phyto, derived from the Greek verb putein, from which we get putter or putrefy, to rot. That is to say, the process by which microbes decompose organic matter and produce strange gases, which often stinks an unimaginable awful lot when there is no oxygen, such as on the lower levels of our lakes of interest. A paper from 2002 called The Delphic Oracle, a multidisciplinary defense of the gaseous vent theory, by Henry Spiller, a doctor at the Central Ohio Poison Center, set out to prove these connections. In the paper, there is a very interesting comparison of effect, which I would like to read to you in full. This comparison is built of historical descriptions of usual response and presentation of the phytia with that of mild anesthesia via inhalation of anesthetic gases. So I'll do them like one by one. First the Greek, then the modern one done by a doctor. And there are about 5 different doctors here, but I can't be bothered to read their names. I'll just say what the Greek says, then compare, and then modern doctor, okay? Rapid onset of trance state. Comparison. Full effects in 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Greeks. Calm response, willingly entered the aditon, remained there for hours. Comparison. Pleasant state of being, no sense of anxiety or asphyxiation. Happy to stay under influence of gas for long periods of time. Greek account. Remain conscious. Comparison. Remain conscious. Greek account. Able to maintain seated position. Comparison. Able to maintain seated position. Greek account. Can see others and hear questions. Comparison. Responds to questions and right answers. Comparison. Greek account. Tone and pattern of speech altered. Comparison. Pattern of speech altered. Greek account. Describe out-of-body experience, feeling of being possessed by the god Apollo. Comparison. Altered state. Experience the religious revelations. Greek account. Free association. Images not obviously connected to questions. Comparison. Free association. Random thought pattern not obviously connected to initial questions. Greek account. Recovers rapidly. Comparison. Complete recovery in 5 to 15 minutes from full operable anesthesia. Greek account. Amnesia of events while under influence. Comparison. Amnesia of events while under influence. Okay, there you have it. Very, very similar, right? In the ancient text, we have accounts also of Roman generals forcing women against their will down into the cave. Because though run by priestesses, Apollo isn't our guy after all. But how something so fascinating, something once so spontaneously inspiring, came to be so vulgarized and reproduced in such an uninspired way is a riddle we have asked ourselves in almost every episode of this season. And it is indicated also here just outside the temple entrance, because there, on a 10-meter pole, at the highest position of the site, higher than Apollo, guards a sitting lioness with the face of a human woman. You know her as the Sphinx, who asks uncomfortable, audible questions that make weaker men violent.
Who can say where the road goes, where the day flows, only time? And who can say if your love grows as your heart shows, only time? We Who can say why your heart sighs as your love flies? Only time. And who can say why your heart cries when your love lies? Only
Human control of fire is well established in the archaeological record from before the start of the Middle Stone Age, some 280,000 years ago. But due to the agricultural fundamentalism paradigm, its use as a landscape management tool has only so far been documented in a few Paleolithic contexts. These include in Australia, circa 40,000 years ago, Highland New Guinea, circa 45,000 years ago, and circa 50,000 years ago at Naya Cave in lowland Borneo, according to research that has been carried out, once again, in the last 20 years or so. In the Americas, anthropogenic ignitions have been implicated as major factors in the reconfiguration of faunal and floral communities, as humans first entered these ecosystems, especially within the past 20,000 years, according to a study called Fire and Vegetation Shifts in the Americas at the Vanguard of Paleo-Indian Migration from 2011. In the case of New Guinea and Borneo, we are left with a landscape more reminiscent of that which we introduced in a previous episode regarding the Amazons. We will return to the agroforestal and arboriculturalist aspects of natural farming later in more detail in the next season, when we, for example, learn what Heyerdahl has to say about the mysteries of the coconut islands. But we can add that within biology it seems to be somewhat established, at least that the late Pleistocene extinctions from 50,000 to 4,000 years ago had dramatic ramifications on vegetation communities, notably through the loss of seed dispersal services. As a response to these megafaunal extinctions, humans became surrogate dispersers for many extant trees with large fleshy fruits. The archaeobotanical interpretation of this has only recently begun uncovering the political aspect of this, as we already suggested in a previous episode regarding the conscious construction of massive fruit forest and garden communes in the Amazons. which is somewhat odd since scientists have accepted for a longer period that various apes, for example, have played a major role in the maintenance of fruit trees in the large rainforests all over the world, from Costa Rica to Borneo. What this means for Engels' theory about the importance of labor in man's transition from ape, and how politically we want to look at this generous activity of our monkey friends, I don't know. But it is clear that, due to its apparent apolitical nature, it seems to have been much more easily and faster accepted. However, if you feel like 90,000 years ago is not a far distant enough beginning, dear listener, I just have to let it slip that just next to Lake Malawi, at Lake Tanganyika, at the Kalambo River, archaeologists have discovered a pair of interlocking logs near a waterfall that date to, and brace yourself, 476,000 years ago. The wooden structure predates Homo sapiens, and the lead archaeologist Larry Barham said that if prehistoric wood was preserved as well as stone and bone, quote, we would probably use the term wood age rather than stone age, end of quote. He suggests, interestingly enough, that the linked structure could have been part of a platform for fishing or some other raised surface above the muddy ground, which I have to say, once looking at the massive size of the logs, which in no way could have been carried around casually, suggests a seasonal sedentary life around these lakes of pyrotechnic landscape construction. Another archaeologist, when describing the find, says that they look like quote-unquote Lincoln logs, the American children's toy with which you build log houses, which, if we take him seriously, means that their age might upset the popular assumption, which credits this invention to the Vikings in 11th to the 12th century. I'm sure there were loads of others before. I've actually seen some in like Jomon villages or recreations from 2000 BC in Japan. But that is the common assumption anyway. Needless to say, considering that the previous oldest known wooden structure was only 9,000 years old, not 500,000, and considering that they found wood tools possible for digging and wedging to keep structures more stable, it might even be an underestimate to suggest, as did one of the archaeologists in an interview, that, quote, our knowledge about the use and the processing of wood in the most ancient periods of prehistory is comparable to the tip of an iceberg, end of quote. And, on top of that small tip, we will add to this the recent discovery of tools discovered on Flores Island in today's Indonesia, home to the so-called hobbits, which had a head the size of a chimpanzee. And they are 1.5 to 1 million years old, which has suggested to archaeologist Dr. Adam Brum, who made the discovery, that they are the earliest remains implying human seafaring technology, and that, quote, the pronouncements that the H. floresiensis lacked the brain size necessary to make stone artifacts and tools are therefore based on preconceptions rather than actual evidence, end of quote. Preconceptions, which are, let's be frank, contemporary phrenological rest products of the skullboys in the 19th century, which have been matched up with a chronology of stone tools of the Stone Age rather than the wood of the Wood Age, and which has made sure that Aryo-heroic raft has stayed afloat until today, because, unfortunately, as suggested, we don't have much else to go on. Nonetheless, I think we have once again been given material to see ridiculously old communes and harbors from which explorations pulsated out to curiously keep things interesting, rather than out of dire existential necessity. But returning to our grains, to sum up the point, since the theory that fleshy fruit trees adapt to new seed dispersers, eventually a substantial part of them being humans, have been around for longer and well accepted, we will assume, as does a new generation of archaeobotanists, that a similar process occurred in small seeded wild crops. Getting accustomed to these wild grains, learning their names and phenotypic characteristics in the thousands, their taste, their use, their myriad life-sustaining qualities and life-altering qualities, I wonder if this does not only make gatherers seem more like natural farmers as they prepare the land that they would later browse, forage and pick and cut and pull from to sustain themselves, but also as we began pyrotechnically preparing the wild grass landscapes for these hoofed herbivores to help us maintain and reproduce them, especially around lakes that they would have to visit. Our activities are starting to look more like continental wildlife herders than hunters. And herding is actually the correct word, since that is what tends to relate to semi-wild animals, whereas the case of domesticated animals carries the proper word mustering or droving, not herding. And we have evidence in modern cases of such activities, of herds having shifted vegetation communities back in favor of megafaunal dispersed species. Which means, considering the evidence so far put forward, that nothing stops us from assuming that what I am calling wildlife herding, which would have included and involved bigger animals in greater numbers during the Ice Age, was consciously practiced by humans to create vast plains of edible grains, once we no longer just follow them around like hunters or gatherers and hunters.
We've got to get moving. Come on, Sam. Mr. Frodo, look. It's an oliphant. No one at home will believe this.
This would have involved consciously increasing their numbers by killing off their predators, as to open up more landscapes, as well as maintaining their numbers as to not have our anthropogenic meadows and wild fields overcrowded with hungry animals. Again, the dialectics of the wild boars and the felines depicted at Göbekli Tepe. Indeed, we see overlapping landscapes on almost all continents, from endozoochory to human seed dispersal to cultivation and later domesticated agriculture. Where the bison wandered, there stood later the center of domestication of the Eastern agricultural complex. Where the camelids of the Andes grazed, there stood later the domestication range for quinoa. And along the great migration of wild beasts, we find in the west the presumed domestication range for pearl millet. In the center, the presumed domestication range for sorghum. And in the southeast, the presumed domestication range for finger millet. Likewise, in the core range of modern herded yaks, there too we have the presumed domestication range for buckwheat. In short, we see a global dialectics of three major variables of interactivity and indeed interpassivity, of plants, humans and animals, a deep time fluctuation of natural and anthropogenic dispersal strategies and adaptations by the plants. Furthermore, to situate recent African discoveries within some kind of timeline, if we remember to look at plant adaptations not as a form of linear progress, as we are taught to do, regarding the Oldowan or Mode 1 stone tool industry, being followed by the Aquelian Mode 2 stone tool industry, to the Mosterian or Mode 3 stone tool industry, followed by the Argnasian Mode 4 stone tool industry, etc., etc. We should note that the levels of digestibility of seed protections and the level of dormancy of the small seeds, i.e. their adaptations to presumably exclusively human dispersal, would also have fluctuated, becoming lost or reduced, going through periods of return or increase, in tandem with the fluctuations of the amount of human dispersers, should, let's say, this initially symbiotic relationship have, at hard times, become too obligate. Recall, for example, obligate symbionts of the ants, where neither disperser or that dispersed can live without the other. Perhaps there were communities in deep time who did become dependent on domesticates, and as a consequence were plagued by famine, just like we are today, and the traces of this taking place disappeared through the process of de-domestication. No, Marcus, that is way too smart of a stupid move. They could never have figured that out. And if they did, we would most certainly know about it. Be that as it may, Masanobu Fukuoka suggested in latter years that the higher stages of natural farming would construct ecosystems that self-reproduce themselves in favor of human desires, but with limited or without human intervention. To clarify, the fluctuations of the Wood Age and recent African discoveries upsets the postulated hierarchical mood system of stone tools in which, curiously enough, Mood 3 and Mood 4 is suspiciously, exclusively European. Since even though the very fine sketches of the French Aborigines, which are the only cave paintings I've seen with my own eyes and are surely the major reason for their higher Roman numerals, beyond the supposed levels of increased symmetry of stone tools, we note that these presumed staircase steps have their precedents, and possible artistic contemporary, if you like, in Southern Africa, 50,000 years before, in the 100,000-year-old ochre processing workshop at Blombos Cave, by people who even took the time to decorate their mortals and pestles, with which they blended and perfected their metal and mineral pigments, keeping them in naturally beautiful seashells before expressing themselves and their very old way of life and natural history on lithic canvases. Strange then that no such decoration of the means of artistic production have, as far as I know, been found at the French caves since the Cro-Magnons, so beloved by Himmler, often described as the first modern human or the first artist by magazines like Science, Nature, the Smithsonian, etc., etc., are level 4 humans, and the 100,000-year-old Africans are only level 1 or level 2 humans. It's so strange. Something must have happened to their World of Warcraft understanding of life. Considering the possibility that these South African grinding stones were also used for the processing of wild small seeded grain grasses, used for flour, used for porridges, pestos and hummus dips. Perhaps we should open up the dialectics of the great doubt and suggest that the aleatory, borderline whimsical, here and there movement of deep time should be appreciated in terms of ecological know-how that sought to leave as little marks as possible, to be as sustainable as possible, not only with regards to how flint was chipped. A metabolism generally free of rifts, as Marxist ecologists would describe it, economically made possible by wooden architecture, wooden equipment, and pyrotechnique lost to time. That is to say, a general relationship of production and modes of labor that sought to avoid labor, and refused to measure productivity in the amount of sweat sweated, since no one, no matter how strong, can compare to the might of fire or the strength of growing trees. And by intentionally avoiding sporadic instances of spontaneous, full adaptation by the plants to human domestication, I am sure they must have abandoned sites where it did begin to occur, feeling it was cursed until it finally returned to the wild and something called a more natural state, whatever way they thought it ought to be. For indeed, and this is just a theory, When you get stuck and start dreaming about productivity as a way of getting unstuck, you simultaneously start having nightmares about the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor. That you will never have enough, so to speak, even though you do, and in this way, the way of nightmares, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. And do you know, dear listener, what is that other word for that dead-end circular process of der menschlichen Arbeit in abstracto? Yes, that's right. The name of human labor in the abstract, the fictitious labor of future nightmares, is capital. Capital, which might come visit you in its cruelest, most slave-like form when you, like me, during my years of wandering, took up the Tibetan Chöd practice of sleeping on graveyards for weeks on end, and among bones picked naked by crows, scattered in all directions, bleached and resembling shells, as the early Satipatthana Sutras suggest, to experience the bardo, or the liberation through hearing during the intermediate state, when the dark-skinned yogini helped me in surpassing the fear of the skull that once adorned Göbekli Tepe. Or, to be more honest, dear listener, you could just turn off the lights in your room, try to make it real dark, and sit for a bit before sleep. Maybe read, maybe don't, again and again. Though perhaps less exotic and mad, I have found it to be just as useful in the practice of the clear light visions. After all, when in the lands ruled by rapidly decaying capital, the Mahashmashana, that is the great cemetery, is all around us. So stay for the outro, dear listener, and let's do the corpse dance together with these arms and watch as it fades ever so slowly.
Her soul, the falling star. At midnight, twice a week, she comes, she leaves, and no one hassled her so far. The quarters have arrived in mail polish, in tailored slacks. Reform past all recognition, resplendent in donor clasp panache. Is a scheme to enrich assholes. What the Godhead had in mind when he hid here such revelations as only singers could describe. the country's boyfriend that he never, ever would live down. Must not have made it to the angels who pass the holy Roman noses round. His pale bullets found your bloodline in a midnight blue Cayenne. She is patient, the act of creation may one day produce a happy man. Shaking like a pole fly up sea as a lake, loves the birthright of young people, and she ain't leaving without his Mahashmashana. All is silent now, and in the next universal dawn, won't have to do the corpse dance, do the corpse dance, do the corpse dance with these arms. He spoke into a hot mic. He sang like a bird. He hadn't had a single drink yet. There's no mistaking what you heard. A perfect lie